All right, this is Dr. Brent Turvey. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about the difference between criminal profiling and psychological profiling, between a criminal profile and a psychological profile, because this issue has been raised. So, first of all, it helps to understand what a criminal profiler is. This is a professional that is responsible for interpreting physical and behavioral evidence. Their job is to examine crime scene behavior, examine victimology, and examine behind resulting from the violence of a crime. Their job is to make an indirect assessment of the crime. They're trying to infer the characteristics, the traits, the personality, the habits, the abilities, the connections of an unknown criminal to a crime. This is, again, it's an indirect assessment. They're not talking to a person. They're looking at what the person did. They're looking at how the person made choices. They're looking at how they changed over time as they committed different crimes, and what they did and did. They're looking at their modus operandi. They're looking at their signature behaviors. They're looking at their motive. They're looking at the type of victims that they chose. All of these things, whether they drove a car, whether or not they used a gun, or how they used the gun, all these things are being examined because this is behavior, and behavior represents action and personality. They're to then put that into a written form and give forensic testimony about it, help the police or the court narrow down a suspect pool or understand how this information answers forensic questions that might come up, like motive, intent, like planning, like the number of offenders involved, things like that, or whether or not cases are linked together in a pattern, things like that. This is somebody who would have a degree in criminology. This is somebody who would have a background in behavioral science, but they would be focused on the interpretation of offender behavior because they're looking again at an indirect assessment of the crime. Now, this is very different from a forensic psychologist. A forensic psychologist is a specific type of psychologist that testifies in court. Their job is to do a direct assessment of a defendant or a witness to evaluate them for their reliability in court. Do they understand the charges against them? Are they? Is their statement reliable? Is their state of mind? What's their state of mind during the time they gave their statement, or possibly during the crime? But regardless of that, it's a direct assessment. This direct assessment done by the forensic psychologist is them sitting down with a real person in real life in the room. They're not looking at their crime. They're not looking at their behavior. They're not looking at their modus operandi. They're just doing an assessment of a person. So a forensic psychologist does a psychological evaluation, or also referred to as a psychological profile, sometimes inappropriately, a psychological profile of an individual that they meet and evaluate. That's what a forensic psychologist does. And they are a licensed psychologist. All right? A criminal profiler does an indirect assessment of crime scene and crime scene related activity. Criminologist. It is a difficult distinction for people to grasp because the media has done a very good job of confusing things. The reality is that in movies and television, forensic psychologists are often portrayed as criminal profilers. Now, I say this. There are some really great forensic psychologists out there who make excellent criminal profilers once they have the additional training and develop the additional expertise to do that. It helps to get board certification. In terms of criminal profilers who are forensic psychologists, it usually doesn't go that direction because becoming a forensic psychologist requires a much more involved career path with a lot more education and board certification. So the criminologist usually does not go the route of the forensic psychologist. The real problem for criminologists who are acting as criminal profilers comes when they get on the stand and they get in trouble for doing psychological assessments. For example, we've had there's the case of Greg McCrary. He's a retired FBI profiler. His undergraduate degree is in music, and his graduate degree is in professional psychological services. That's a degree that you get from the and it's used to be a guidance counselor at a high school. Now, That's an interesting degree, but it's not a psychological degree. On his resume, multiple times he has listed his degree as an MA in psychology, ignoring what the real designation of the degree is. This will lead you to believe that it's from a school of psychology, and he will use that degree to actually get of criminal defendants or of suspects in his profiles. And multiple times he has been called to account for this and had his excluded because of the fact that he's not a psychologist, that he's giving false testimony about being a psychologist or having a psychological background, and he's certainly not qualified to diagnose the crime scene. That's very dangerous. So there's a lot of confusion coming from either way, but it's very straightforward. The psychologist does an assessment of a person sitting in front of them, and the criminologist, who is usually the criminal profiler, is doing an examination of crime scene behavior, doing an indirect assessment. So the profiler is doing an indirect assessment, the psychologist is doing a direct assessment. The profiler works with behavior and evidence and the violent remnants that are left behind. The psychologist is evaluating the person and what they're saying at a given moment. So I hope this clears it up a little bit. What I would just say is this: if you're watching it on TV, it's not real. And if you want to know whether a person's qualified to be making the kind of statements they are, you have to look at their formal education and their certifications. All right. If you have any specific questions about this, feel free to ask. Thank you very much.